So with our registration system in place and ready to go, all that's left is logging users in. So let's head back to the user model and implement the algorithm that we outlined earlier, which we have right here. I'm actually just going to delete this for the time being. I don't need you. And so let's look at the first one. We can actually probably just copy some of this. But instead, the required fields are just email and password. Right? Looks good. Okay. And now we need to look up the user in the database by email. We've done this one before already too, right? Const existing user, something like that. Cool. So I'm just going to take that here. Great. And I'm just going to say user instead of existing user, but that seems to be working fine. Now, what we're doing here is if a user is found, compare the submitted password with the password in the DB. If there is a match, return the user. Okay. So we'll say if the user is found, then we will check to see if the password is valid. So we'll say const is valid equals await bcrypt.compare. And this is great because bcrypt handles all of this for us. And this essentially, again, a promise to either resolved with a comparison result or rejected with an error. So that's good to know. So we'll check if this is valid, and we will pass in the user's submitted password, and we will compare it to the password that is stored in the database. And if that is valid, we will return the user. Otherwise, none of this will return, and it'll go right down to here where it'll throw a new unauthorized error. And so that's pretty much all we need. And again, note that we're using bcrypt.compare method instead of just hashing the submitted password directly, mainly because that's not sufficient, as the salt stored in the hashed password in the database is required to do the comparison. But now that we have that ready to go, let's start our server. Okay, things seem good. Let's try it out. First, let's create a new user. Let's say me@u.them, and I'll just make a very short password, and I'll say this person is not coming, so they're not bringing any guests. And then I will register them. Okay, things work perfectly. And then we will attempt to log them in, but actually first, let's test that the login does not work. So let's log them in with no credentials. Okay, great. Missing email and request body. That's fantastic. We should probably validate that email at some point too, but let's leave it out for now. Now let's try it with some invalid credentials. So let's do this, and let's get rid of this because we don't need it anymore. And let's do an incorrect password. Wrong. Let's see what happens. Invalid email password combo. Great. Okay, let's try it with the correct password, but the wrong, or actually, you know what? Let's do it with someone who doesn't exist. Non-existent. Okay, cool. Same thing. Seemed to work. And then let's go ahead and also let's do it with the correct, but a wrong password. Okay, amazing. Now, you might have noticed one thing that's different here is that we don't actually, you can tell that there's a clear difference between when the user submits an incorrect email and when that doesn't exist in our system. This returns really quickly. But when we submit a user that does exist with an incorrect password, it takes a little bit longer. Now, that's something that a hacker could use to figure out which emails exist in our platform, and so that's something we'd probably want to account for anyway. A good way to do that is just, no matter what, even if the user doesn't exist, hash their password. And this will ensure that bcrypt at least takes a certain amount of time every time any user attempts to authenticate, and that can mitigate a lot of attacks as well. But for the time being, again, this seems to work. We feel good about it. Now the last thing we need to do is just make sure that it actually works when we submit valid credentials. So let's do it. And boom, everything works magically. One small problem though. We are returning the user, password and all. That's probably not a good idea. Let's standardize our system for serving public-facing user objects. And that can be done pretty simply. Let's do this. Let's just say static async. Let's call it make public user. And it takes in a user. And it returns ID, user.id, email, user.email, RSVP status, user.rsvp. Actually, I think it's this, right? There we go. And num guests, user.num guests, and then created at user.created at. And now let's actually use this instead of just returning the user as it is. So we'll say return user dot make public user with the user. So hopefully that works. Let's try it out. Let's do it one more time. We'll authenticate. Fantastic. And now we have a nicely formatted user, and their password is not included here. Now, we probably want to add that to the registration method as well. Let's do that actually in the registration method here. Instead of just returning the user, let's do the same thing. We'll return user dot make public user with the user. And that feels pretty nice. And that should be pretty much the final touches for a working authentication system, at least for this API. Now, there's definitely a few things we'd probably want to include. In particular, if we want users to stay logged into our system, since at the moment there's no way to keep a user logged in, we simply accept their credentials, make sure they're valid, send back the user info. Allow them to register, make sure it's valid, send back the user info. So I think in the next series, we'll start to tie this all together and leverage JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs, to handle authenticated requests to our API and ensure that our certain routes are protected from unauthenticated requests. But for the time being, let's wrap this up with our final version control dance and a simple get status, get add models, user, get status, looks good, get commit, oops, spelled that wrong, get commit, finished, fini, and that is it. Uh-oh, I did something wrong here. Okay, there we go. All right, so in the next series, we'll tie this all together, take our full authentication system and couple it with our React front end and run through the entire Perl stack and get something going for real.